Hey everyone, welcome to the Compliance Quarter. My name's Milan, and today we're going to talk about some compliance topics with security. And it's really exciting to me to start this channel and start these podcasts. There's a lot of information out there about compliance frameworks, PCI and HIPAA, but very few that actually talk about how do we move the ball forward as we continue to globalize and we continue to scale out at the world stage. So again, I'm very excited to be here today. And today I'm going to introduce Lee, who will introduce himself as we start talking about this topic that we did a blog post on. So Lee, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and talk about the blog, which is linked down in the description, by the way, and what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, thanks, Milan. So Lee Vorthman and Milan and I are peers here at our current employers. But the topics here we'll discuss are both of our own opinions, which I think Milan probably should have up on the screen at some point. But I've been in the field for quite some time now, and I'm pleased to be able to bring our thoughts and conversations about these intersections of different security topics such as compliance and security together to figure out how we kind of navigate these things. So the blog was an idea that Milan and I kicked around for a while, and we finally came to a reasonable topic that I think we could both contribute on, and that got sent out. And a lot of the topics you'll hear today were topics that we did write and discuss on the blog, and so we're happy to share those with you.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. And also, really, I'd like to get a sense of who's with us today. So in the chat, if you could just call out where you're from, maybe, and whether or not you're an engineer, a third-party auditor, or a corporate compliance person, it'd be good to help us tailor content as well. And also, as we go through here, what I'd ask is, we will take questions, and if you go ahead and put your questions down with a Q and a colon down in the chat, we'll be able to pull them up as well later. If we don't get to them during the live stream, we'll talk about them at the end. I'll pull them all up, and Lee and I will walk through them. So Lee, you want to go ahead and start off with the first part, which is about growing regulatory requirements, the impact to the company versus single business unit. Love to hear security's view on that.
Yeah, sure. So, this is an interesting topic. I think you and I deal with, at past and current positions, right? But really, I think what Milan is referring to in this question is how do you navigate, security and compliance, whether it's for the entire company, do you want to standardize on something, or do you want to try and do something for each of the separate lines of business or business units that you have? And this really, I think, comes up when you're at extremely large companies. But it could also manifest itself at smaller companies if you have really independent, lines of business or business units. And so generally, my opinion on this is that it's very difficult, right, for a large company to standardize on a single compliance framework or even a single security framework. Now, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't do that, right? It's very difficult, right? And if you think about this, right, the reason for that is that large companies usually come together because of acquisition, or they've entered a new market or something like that, and they want to give a certain amount of autonomy, right, to that business unit. And so the business units may have different requirements, right? One may operate in the financial sector, one may operate in the healthcare sector, one may operate in the government space, right? And all of those compliance activities are going to be different, right? And so if you mandate that all of the lines of businesses go out and do the same compliance activities across all of them, it may be not only unnecessary, but it could be extremely costly to those lines of businesses to get compliance audits and certifications for things that they don't actually need to drive business. So, I think certainly that's something to navigate. It's not impossible, but it is, it's something you have to keep in mind. The other, on the flip side of that, what I'll say is that while for the business it may make sense not to standardize on a single compliance or security framework, this presents a gap for customers, right? So customers look at your business, business, whatever it is, and they say, oh, all of the products have the same thing. That's the impression, that's the implicit, idea that they have. And that may not be the case if you have different business units with different levels of compliance activities. So I think this is a really difficult, area to navigate, and one that, we'll continue to discuss as we get into further topics. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks. So I agree with a lot of that. And what I would say is that I've seen this growth of things that impacted a single line of business or vertical are now becoming these broader general regulatory requirements that apply to the entire company. I mean, you see this all the time, that they're not just for the financials, but they apply to everybody, whether or not you have a financial product or not. And I think that's one of the growing areas of concern, which is how do you scale that across particularly the large companies where you may or may not actually have a central regulatory team that knows how to translate all of those requirements into engineering tasks. Because remember, all that has to come down to a piece of evidence, and a control or a test. And the businesses, particularly for businesses that buy other companies, they may not even be standardized with the way they approach that within their own business groups. And I think that's one of the areas of not only growing concern, but also disconnect in the fact that the skills that you had to have for dealing with those controls at a much more business level case, they have to bubble up now and figure out some way to standardize and report and track, because the company can't sign off unless every line of business can sign off that they're meeting these regulatory requirements. And I think that is one area where that impact of change is not only becoming problematic, but it's also just really hard operationally to go do. And I think that's a challenge for security and compliance as we kind of go through trying to figure out, because a lot of times there's no central authority at the corporate level that really can enforce a lot of these translations down to the business group. So it's going to take this partnership, I think, at a much more higher level than we're used to seeing in some cases, in order to show that we can meet these regulatory requirements.
No, I definitely agree with you. And I think that this probably comes to an area of, organizational culture or structure, right? Where if you have an organization that's somewhat decentralized, right? So each line of business is left to, I'll say, their own devices to determine what's best for that line of business, then I think, to your point, it might be very difficult, right, to get some of these standardization and compliance activities across the board. But if you have a very strong centralized team, right, that has oversight and governance, and security definitely will benefit from this, right? If you have a single security framework that you're using to evaluate and measure controls, if you have a standardized way to measure risk, all of that eventually will make, in my opinion, compliance activities hopefully easier, right? Because now they can rely back on, looking at that security program, getting the evidence that they need, and then, they know that it's going to be the same across all the lines of business. So I definitely think that it's organization dependent, but the holy grail, as you have said, would be to have a centralized team that does standardize. But obviously, that's up to the business and the cost, and honestly how they're structured culturally and organizationally.
That's right. Yeah, I think it's good to hang on this one for a minute, because I think we'll talk about it more about what's been changing in the security and compliance realm along with engineering. But I think it is important to recognize that it takes both sides of that equation, at least in my view, from compliance. You have to have a really good translation of the requirements broadly, and then you also have to have that partnership with each line of business on how you're going to effectively meet it. So you have to meet in the middle. And I think where the challenge comes into play is who actually has the ultimate authority to set a requirement for individual lines of business. I think there are lots of policy setting that happens where the translation hasn't actually been focused on and how to broadly translate it for engineering. Because I can tell you that I think a lot of challenges, a lot of people that write policy have never worked in engineering. So there's this language that we have to work through. So each side understands kind of what the goal is. And then that translation could actually be implemented, because there's a lot of policies, as I know you've seen in security, that come down and it's like you can't even implement this policy in many cases. And so where is that partnership to go define a really good one up front that every team would have, mostly an ability to execute on? So I think it's going to be a very interesting space as these requirements become much more heavy on the corporate side on how to actually meet these, governmental or these other broad industry regulations.
Yeah, you and I were kicking around this topic a little while ago, and I do think, the the requirements aspect is interesting, right? Because, the line of business, should have a certain amount of autonomy, right, to decide what's best for them. But at the same time, right, they should also have some sort of oversight and governance that is doing what's best for the business to manage risk or whatever it's going to be. And certainly security policies and standards and compliance activities won't be successful, right, if they're thou shalt, right, and there is no option to, have a conversation about what's realistic, right? If you're prescribing some sort of control or policy and it doesn't fit the business, then that's not going to work out very well, right? You're just causing either unnecessary churn, or you're just going to butt heads and lose the goodwill of that group, for actually listening to you when something does matter. So I definitely agree with you. There's a partnership here. There's definitely a balance, right? And that balance should come down to, like, is this actually, helping to move the needle in terms of addressing or managing risk? and is it actually a business need in terms of we have to go after this compliance activity to satisfy some sort of industry regulation that we have to do to operate in that business, or that if we don't do it right, we will lose customers or whatever it's going to be. So I definitely think, there's a triangle here, right, of like the overall governance, like the security team and compliance team, and then like the dev team, right, which have to be operating to make the triangle. And if not, if it's unbalanced, right, then that I'm switching from triangles to stools. But if not, right, then the stool will tip over because one leg is shorter than the other, type thing, right? So I definitely agree that these things need to work in partnership across the org to do really what's best for the business.
Right. And we didn't even talk about the elephant in the room, which is cost. Because some of these regulations, right, a certain line of business may have to go do engineering work to go meet that for the company, but they don't need it at all. And so there's also the cost aspect of who's going to bear the brunt of a line of business having to go fund something that they actually don't make any money on because the regulation requires it for the company. So we'll save that one for maybe another topic, because that in itself is a whole nother level of negotiation at the senior level to justify these kinds of asks. So I think that's great, Lee. And so thanks for that. And again, if there are questions, please do just put them down in the chat and we will get to them. So we're going to switch gears a little bit now, and we're going to switch to security and compliance practices and what has changed. So Lee, why don't you start off with security and tell us what you've seen change in the industry in recent history?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so the biggest change that I'm seeing lately are an increase in customer and regulatory demand for transparency. They're really pushing for, you need to disclose these things. The new SEC regulations, for example, are you have to disclose a material breach, and also if it's been going on for a certain duration of time. These are all mechanisms, geared towards trying to get more transparency into what the businesses are doing. And really, I think this has come out of some historical context where, you don't want to have a business or any entity, right, whether it's a government body or whatever, just sit on an incident or a breach or failure of a compliance activity, right, and then, not notify customers or, do what they need to do. So I think what's happening is that, all of the customers and partners in the supply chain are attempting to kind of hedge their risk or manage their risk, and they're sending an increasing regulation right across theirs and sending questionnaires to try and assess that so that they can figure out how they want to operate in that space. And the challenge is that when you you brought up cost, right, but when you move towards these increased transparencies or these reduced times to fix or these reduced notification times, sure, we all want to get there, right? The ideal would be real-time notification of everything, right? Now you have to balance that, right, with, do I really want to put all this stuff out there for everyone to be able to see? Like, transparency comes with sometimes a decrease in privacy or a decrease in intellectual property, or maybe things that should be kept confidential. So, and then on the other side, they also come with, maybe they're technologically prohibitive, right? Is it realistic for me to have an incident response team that puts out incidents in real time? I don't know if that's the best thing, right? Because if, let's say that my team says that there's an incident, but it's not actually an incident, well, I just notified a bunch of customers, unnecessarily and eroded goodwill and stuff like that for my business, right? And then, take that a step further. You as you rightfully said, these could be cost prohibitive. Great, we want to move towards real time, whatever it is, but what's the cost on the storage and the network and the compute and the the supportability of that and the operations and the maintenance and everything? I mean, these all have a cost. And so, while I applaud the effort to move towards increased transparency and reduce risk and get better, reporting and visibility of that, and especially as it relates to the compliance space, I think, I don't know that we've reached the right balance yet, right? And I think that we're seeing that in the customer questionnaires that we're getting. We're definitely seeing it in difficulties in technology. So if you're a cloud-based business and you have a modern DevOps principle, modern software development lifecycle, you can write and launch things in seconds or minutes, right? And so how do you balance that with these increased, vulnerability response times and or decreased vulnerability response times and decreased notification times and things like that? So I'm at least seeing the increased, what I'll call like regulatory or compliance pressure on the businesses, but I don't know that we've quite found the right balance for a business in terms of like, great, we want to do that, but we also don't want to charge our customers like, $11 billion for one tiny little product,
Exactly.
So how do you do this, right? I mean, I don't know that we've cracked it, but I think it's moving in the right direction for transparency, but I don't think we've tackled some of the other tangential issues that have come up because of that.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think for me, one of the biggest changes I've seen, and this is going to date me a little bit here, but there's if you think back not that long ago, people only replaced their software and even versions of software after 5 years when hardware went out of life, right? Literally, the hardware would get replaced. That's when you would maybe change the software, even upgrade to the newest version, because the rate of innovation was really slow. And at that time also, we saw that compliance, because the rate of innovation was slow, not only was in its fledgling states, but it was also, you only had to do it like once a year. It wasn't very mature. And since the software and the infrastructure wasn't changing, you really didn't have the amount of potential drift, which causes potential security issues or regulatory issues with how you're managing data. So I think the biggest change for me is around the rate of innovation. We talk about DevSecOps, we talk about changing code daily, if not monthly or quarterly. And I think that's where DevSecOps is meant to address that. You've got faster change management systems and code flow, but the compliance and security processes really haven't changed much. I mean, we're still throwing money and people at collecting hundreds and thousands of pieces of evidence in the same old way that it's been done for many years, but it doesn't scale anymore. And I think that's where, having to change the thought process, and I know we'll talk about this in the next section, about how are we measuring success? Because I think that's one of the biggest changes. I mean, I'll tell you, there's no longer the blank checkbook, and the unlimited amount of bodies to go and solve compliance problems and do more audits at scale. I mean, the rate of audits that are increasing is just so fast now, and certifications, that you can't keep up if you're going to go at it the old way. So it really does require all of us. And I think it's the same for security. And how are we going to address this at scale when the processes that we were used don't address that today? For example, Bloomberg recently came out with an article where they were talking about the fact that the warfighters cannot get the best technology to the field because FedRAMP takes forever. FedRAMP was built, what, 15 years ago in terms of the process for certification? So even Bloomberg is calling out that has to change. And I'm not sure anybody has the exact right answer, other than I think you have to change what the metrics for success are. And I think that's the biggest change that I've seen, is how do you change that story about really going from an on-prem, once every 3 to 5 year change to a rate of change that requires you to have, what we've talked about, and we will talk about more, is continuous compliance, because you really can't afford to allow that level of drift. And we're seeing that today, even with SOC reports. Financial SOC reports now are required quarterly versus twice a year or once a year, because they're concerned of the rate of drift in between the periods. So that's the only way they can enforce it, is by using a bat. Not by changing the metrics to show you're never drifting, but we'll just go check you really hard every quarter and just make you brute force through it. So I think for me, that was one of the biggest things that have changed, is this rate. And I know as we continue to look for better ways to go implement this, it's going to be really interesting to see where both of our industries change in order to meet these newer, what I call, assumptions and requirements. So I think that's really interesting, because if you think about how we pay for this stuff today, even with auditors, they bill us for hours. So who's really incentivized to do this work more efficiently? I mean, the auditors, they charge you for the amount of work that's done. And if it's very inefficient and you have to go collect all these pieces of evidence every time, guess what? It's going to be very expensive for the businesses, and they're just not going to brunt the cost of that anymore. So it's a great, interesting area to kind of go and look at history and see how things have changed.
Yeah, I think those are great points that you brought up. And I think the biggest one that, I took away from your comment is that, if I think back to 15 or 20 years ago, right, when, the cybersecurity industry was really maturing, or at least coming out, right? I wouldn't say it's probably as mature as it could be, but it was evolving and coming out, and everyone was focusing on, we need to worry about security. We need to worry about security, right? Well, I think we're at a phase now, long enough in the teen years or the adolescent years of a security program that, CISOs in general, or your security program in general, needs to operate like a business, right? It's no longer sufficient, right, to just say, we're protecting against risk, or we're making sure the bad guys don't get in, or whatever it is that you're trying to do. To your point, you have to justify that cost. You can't just throw bodies at that thing. You can't just, go out and buy the latest tool unless you happen to have an unlimited budget, right? All of these things have to tie back to a business value and a risk. And especially, as you mentioned, with compliance, these things are getting more and more difficult to justify, where, what if your company has 100 different products and they all have different product life cycles and different development life cycles and different technology stacks? Great. You want to go do SOC 2? You're paying, right, that cost for an auditor for each product 100 times, right? And I mean, maybe for an extremely large business, that makes a lot of sense, but it doesn't make a lot of sense for these medium and small businesses, right? And so I think these are all definite concerns and definite things that compliance and security practitioners need to be aware of. Is how can you make the things that we're doing, whether trying to get security controls in place or trying to get audits to be successful or whatever it is, you have to actually enable the business to do that in a more efficient way. Because if you're, coming back to what you said, if you write a policy that just tells people no all the time, well, not only are they going to ignore it, right, but you may actually cause damage to the business because people won't do that thing. Or if they do it, it has a significant amount of cost to get there, right? So I think these are all great topics probably for a future discussion because we seem to be orienting around cost. But I do think it's very important that as you mature these programs, especially with the speed of software development, it really is difficult to balance the modernization of compliance frameworks, right? As you point out, that have not necessarily kept up to the modernization of the technology stacks that are being used and how quickly software can get developed and cloud infrastructure can get pushed out and all sorts of things, right? It's like, great, we've measured it every 6 months, but it could have changed, drastically in between that time, right?
Exactly. So, we're going to switch, but this is a great segue. And I'll just bring up one point on, I think you made a really great point about what it means to do this kind of work anymore. And we talk, those of us in the industry, security and compliance, we know that compliance and security really is seen as an overhead function, even though it really isn't today. But the real trick is compliance and security, and I'm just not talking about the feature sets of being able to manage your logs, but in and of itself, it's a feature. And it's one of the most important features because nowadays you can almost not go into any regulatory any area without some kind of compliance and security requirements. So really compliance and security in and of itself is a feature in order to enable businesses. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges as we move into the next section about how must security and compliance practices change on really driving this idea that compliance and security is at the same level as a feature. And I've even used this as an example. When people ask me, well, is it important? I said, well, you can sell this product without some little UX change. You've already have it. But can you sell it without, say, PCI, SOC, or HIPAA? If you don't have it, you can't make $1 without it. So what level does that make it actually in line of the feature, feature value with other like actual end user features that you do? Because again, it's maybe not the most engaging work to do as an engineer, but it's the one from a business perspective that's really going to open and maintain revenue. So Lee, as we kind of transition into the how must practices change, love to hear from you on how you see security practices needing to change moving forward.
Yeah, I'll pick up on your last your thread there that you just mentioned, but I think it's really important to shift perspective in that security and compliance programs don't always have to be a cost center, right? So if you're done your job correctly, right, you're tying back that compliance activity to like a business function or value, a customer need, whatever it is. And what I've done at past jobs for security activities is that you're getting customer questionnaires, you're getting requests for customer engagements and calls and things like that, and all of those things, right? You can track. It's really easy to go to the salesperson and say, hey, how much is this deal worth? Oh, $100,000. Great. I'm just going to put that down, even though I'm not seeing the commission for it, right? At the end of the year, you do 10, 20 of those. Wow, that's 100, that's $1 million to $2 million that you did, right? For helping out the business indirectly, right? So I do think it's important to realize that these costs that we're talking about, whether they're compliance or security activities, are not just sunk costs, right? You can actually translate those things into how you sell your products, how you message your business, the brand of your business, right? Like, are you seen as a security first company or not? And all of these things kind of relate down to how you message and fund your program. Now, into the question, right? What has changed or what needs to change? I think we alluded on it in the past questions. Is that really, I think with the speed of technology and where things are going in environments, and what we're seeing from increased regulation and pressure, both in the U.S. and abroad, is that really I think security teams and hopefully this will benefit compliance teams is they need to shift to a continuous compliance model, right? And so, right, the ideal, the holy grail would be that you launch your code into your whatever container and your application is running, and you've done that spread it across your 100,000 applications for scale. Well, great. What happens when someone makes a minor change in that? Well, we should be able to detect that immediately. We should be able to know whether that complies with our company policies as whether that has shifted anything in the compliance frameworks that we know we have to do, such as PCI, HIPAA, FedRAMP, on and on and on, right? And that would be the ideal, because then when you go to measuring, for the example, the effectiveness of a security program, hey, have we reduced risks, or what's going on with our risk? You now have a real time, right? What's going on with that? Oh, look, we pushed this application, we forgot to patch it. Wow, we spiked up. Oh, we did a great job in this quarter and we reduced it. Great. We're obviously doing something right. That can feed into the compliance program where we say, they come to you, hey, we need all of your evidence for our SOC audit. Great. Go look at this thing. They've already pulled it all in real time. And we know before you measure us every 6 months, we know ahead of time whether or not we're falling off or whether we're staying on track for those compliance activities. So I really think, getting into this kind of like continuous evaluate, report, control, rinse and repeat type thing for the environments, especially as you move more towards a DevOps type cloud native, application stack for a modern software development lifecycle, you really need to shift towards that continuous compliance model. And then the last thing I'll say, which we did touch on in a couple previous questions, is that the challenge with all of this and what needs to change is that security and compliance and whatever other, security function or compliance function or related function you want to link to that, whether it's legal or something like that, privacy, they don't own these things, right? I'm not the application owner. I'm not the business owner. I don't launch the system. I don't log into it, whatever, right? The business owners that are actually making these decisions for the cadence of their software development, for what they're going to put in, as you said, a feature that may or may not enhance or degrade the security or compliance activity, they need to be held accountable, right? It's like if they're making a decision and delaying something that is going to cost, a failure, for example, of a compliance audit, okay, then that's a real conversation with that business leader about that, not only from a compliance standpoint, but from a security standpoint. Like, are we going to inherently or implicitly accept this risk without a conversation, right? And so I think what's difficult in having a centralized or a dedicated security and compliance team is that often they're seen as like, oh, they'll just do it. Well, it's like, that's not really their role, right? I would argue, right? Their role is to act as, if you remember Office Space, like I'm a people person, right? I take the requirements from the customers and give it to the engineers. That's kind of honestly what the foundation of the job is that we're supposed to translate these things and help the business do these things better. Certainly we're going to be there doing certain things that are specific to security. But when it comes to a business system, right, the person that owns that really needs to be held accountable for putting things in their sprints, getting those things on the roadmap, meeting the deadlines that they have for requirements, all of those things. Because if they don't, our jobs are going to be impossible because we don't actually own those things. We're not the ones logging in and doing those things for those business type of systems. So that's kind of my soapbox for what I think needs to change. And I'm happy to continue.
No, it's good. There's lots to unpack in that. So I think we should spend a few minutes because I think this is one of our meatiest topics of today's live stream that I think is really valuable to dig into. So let's talk about real briefly what the last thing you were talking about, which is holding people accountable, right?
Yeah.
I think that's a very interesting area because when you just mentioned it, like who's responsible for getting this into sprints and getting it actually done is the engineering team. There's no question about that. But many times, do they even have the right knowledge and skill to do that, particularly on the security side, right? Because as you said, the central teams are the ones with the real expertise, right? But they don't always even have the authority to help try to negotiate an enforcement to it. That's something we see every day, right? Who gets to make the ultimate business risk decision for anything? The line of business owner, right? Like they have to weigh all of this and kind of determine that. So have you seen a real change in moving to continuous compliance from the security perspective, say in the last 5-7 years? I mean, have you really seen the ball move in terms of, hey, we have these security and compliance things that have been around forever. Have you seen the ball move towards the left, which is getting more towards continuous compliance?
I've definitely seen a shift in awareness. I think the challenge that you mentioned is that, right, look, the development teams, the engineering teams, they are on the hook for producing the features and products and whatever else that are going to make the company money, right? And when it comes down to it, right, there's a real trade-off between do we work on this thing that doesn't make us money or is indirectly making us money versus do we actually put this new feature out that our customers want? And so I've seen an increased awareness in the leaders of that by, okay, we don't do this thing. We missed our pick one, FedRAMP, right? For example, we're now going to get deregulated or whatever, or decertified. That's a problem, right? And I think there's increased awareness of it. Now, the challenge is how do you structure this, right? So, the lowly engineer who's just trying to do his day job and get his sprint satisfied and finish his code base, right, is like, probably not the guy to advocate, right, that we need to fix this patch right away, right? I would argue he probably should, but he may not have the firepower, right, to be able to stand up to that, business leader to be like, no, we have to do this when there's some other priority. So I think what hasn't necessarily shifted, at least what I've seen, is that the culture of balancing this, right? And what's the right balance? And there was a book that came out, which is escaping me. I'll have to put it in the comments later. But there was a bunch of PhDs that went out and researched modern businesses that had a modern software development lifecycle that were cloud native, and had done all these things. And they actually found that when you included security and compliance in that, it actually indicated a more mature team that ultimately was able to have a greater velocity, reduced risk, faster time to market, all of these things. And really the culture kind of inherently kind of coalesced around that. So I do think that because I'll say the security industry is still kind of in its adolescence phases, or maybe early 20s, if you will, in terms of like the maturity of what we're doing. I don't think that maybe some of the software kind of development and business type practices have caught up to the fact that some of these security and compliance practices can actually help you. And if you do them inherently as part of your feature set or your code base, where you don't have to go back and do them again, not only are you saving yourself money because you've done it earlier in the software development lifecycle, but it actually inherently becomes a value to your product and again, kind of overall boosts the culture of the team. So to answer your question more succinctly, I don't think we're quite there yet. But I definitely am seeing the trends that are getting us there. But as you know, at our current and past companies, right, there are definitely historical and legacy and just kind of, it takes a long time, right, to turn a big company to be able to get to those modern practices. And how do you do that while still making money on your current products, right? There's all these things that obviously come back to business needs. So we certainly haven't cracked it, but I do think people are more aware of it, lately, at least in the past 5 years.
Yeah, I'd say I agree with you. I don't know what I should take about that comment in the 20s. I mean, are you kind of saying that for me, like winter is coming? Is that what you're saying there? I think that's what you're telling me there, Lee. You're telling me that I'm getting old and winter is here. I hope I'm not Edward Stark, though. That's all I'm saying, Lee. Don't put me in the grave yet.
I think that the kind of the cybersecurity industry that we have today kind of started around the .com kind of era, like you say, like 1999, 2000, which would put us in our early to mid 20s. Now you could argue that's been going before that, and it definitely was, right? But in terms of like how people were starting to think about, the technology stacks and trying to put formality around, compliance frameworks and security frameworks and controls, I definitely think we've come a long way, but I don't think we're quite there yet. And the reason I say that too is that if you see this raging debate, we're going to go off topic here, but you're going to see this raging debate, right, about what's the role of the CISO, right? Does the CISO report to the CIO? Do they report to the CTO? Do they report to the CFO? Do they report to the chief legal counsel? Do they report to the CSO instead of the CISO?
Or do they report to the new chief compliance officer that people are putting into some companies, right?
Or the privacy officer.
That's right.
And,
That's right.
Do they report to the board or not? And we haven't quite navigated what the security role of an executive is within the organization. It's coming, right? I mean, the SEC put out new requirements that you have to obviously have, cybersecurity expertise on your board. But I don't think we've quite elevated the security executive positions to the same level that the CFO and CTO and other kind of legacy C positions have had for, decades. And I think until we kind of get there, that's why I say cybersecurity in general, which I'm lumping compliance into that, is a little bit in its sort of adolescence, kind of like early 20s, until we kind of navigate how that should, figure out within the organizational structure. That's just my thoughts.
It's really good. And I think that might be a topic in itself about what is the future role of compliance and security and what it should be in a company. I think there's a lot of different thoughts on that. One of our follow-on questions, if we get to it, will be very interesting to that. But so I want to talk a little bit about compliance and what I see needs to change in the compliance space. So I do believe that with a big change like this, we need to think about compliance as a business. And, I always say that every exec I've ever worked with puts everybody in one of three buckets, whether they'll admit it openly or not. And people on my team know I say this all the time. You're either making money, saving money, or costing money. Like that's really what it comes down to. And so I think what's incumbent upon us as compliance professionals is, how do we think about compliance as a business? And, I always say that every exec I've ever worked with puts everybody in one of three buckets, whether they'll admit it openly or not. And people on my team know I say this all the time. You're either making money, saving money, or costing money. Like that's really what it comes down to. And so I think what's incumbent upon us how do we show we're not just costing money? And, we only get so much credit, in my view, for opening up the new markets, because I'm not out hucking wares and trying to sign deals, right? The sales team is really, that's their job. We're there to enable them like any other feature, right? Like any other feature, it has to do that. It's a very important part. Don't send me hate mail about sales. I mean, they're the ones that actually make money for the company. It's not meant to be negative. But if we think about if you think about that as from a compliance perspective, okay, making money we can somewhat do, costing money definitely, because we don't actually write code, but we can save money. And I think that one of the ways we change the metrics moving forward is identify a different metric, especially for the engineering leaders, about how we can save them money. And, I talk a lot about in previous, a couple of videos I've done about this thing that we call, what is the currency for engineers? It's not necessarily risk. As you said, risk doesn't mean a whole lot to that single engineer on an engineering team that might have a security bug. It's not measurable to them, right? But what you can measure for engineers, and when I was running a major, $5 billion development project, was time. Like if it took me more time to go do something, that was money out of my pocket. It impeded on my sprint. If compliance came to me late or security outside of the normal, what I would call audit window with requests, or it went late, that's time that was taken away from my other feature loads. So translating the metrics into something that actually is impactful to the engineering leaders, who most of us report to one way, shape, or form, like you said, is very important to show where you are giving them that time through efficiency so they can use that time on something else. Like, for example, we all talk about kickbacks from the audit firms, and that's either because we didn't provide the right evidence they asked for, or the ask was ambiguous and not complete. And so we had to go back multiple times to the engineering teams. Well, when I was receiving all those, nothing made me angrier than when I submitted the first time that it came back 2 to 3, 4 more times for more information or clarity, or I got pulled into a meeting. I mean, those are direct hours I could not be spending on a different engineering thing. So changing those metrics has been extremely valuable in order to show where you have to collect the evidence once. And using a metric that we use called FTR, first time resolutions, I want confidence that that piece of evidence is going to make it all the way up. We'll have to do a different live stream on that because it's way too complicated to talk about today.
This is a super interesting topic, which I want you to give more about, because what you've done in this space is like tremendous. So
sure. So I'll just give an overview here, but I'm going to schedule a separate live stream on this to go through more of the particulars, because it's really about how you go about implementing it. So if you think about collecting evidence, the engineering leaders I've always talked to, they know you have to do auditing. Like, it opens new markets. It's the number one overt trust vehicle with customers to say you've received that SOC 2 for security, whatever the case is. They know they have to do it. What they've always hated was the fact it was very inefficient, or they couldn't measure the efficiency. So by tracking the first time you collect the evidence, does it make it all the way through even the auditor's QA? Well, that's first time resolution, right? You have to collect it once. But the powerful thing is, once you get up to 95%, which is our target metric, is that then you can automate it, because it's going to be a good ask. It's not going to change. It's not going to require more information. So by being able to track how many times things come back, you can assign like 30 minutes per kickback. That's the average I use. I used to run thousands of pieces of evidence myself. And so you can show, as you reduce the number of kickbacks, how much efficiency you're giving back to the engineers. And actually, it's been great because we've been able to show 10 to 20,000 hours that we have saved by reducing that inefficiency that we can now track on paper. And it makes it very easy, because now you can have performance-based auditing with auditors. Auditors that don't give you good evidence instructions, guess what? They're not going to be as competitive in future bids because of the inefficiency that it costs us on both ends. Because you get charged more hours for an inefficient audit, and then you also have the engineering costs on top of that we can now measure. So this has been a very valuable metric to change when you start thinking about compliance as a business, which is how do you save time, which is how you save money. And frankly, once you kind of show this, the engineers get very excited. Actually, they want to work more with you, because now they're seeing how you're reducing these roadblocks that have been traditionally painful. And again, this is a very high level overview. I don't want to get into too many details now, because it would take another couple hours probably, but we'll set up some different sessions. But that's where I talk about what has to change is how we look at this business overall. And I do totally agree with you that we have to continuously push things to the left, which is, compliance by design, privacy by design. They're all very easy topics to say, but they're very hard to actually execute, because it requires a behavior change on the engineering leadership side, which again, how are you going to change their minds? Because the metrics we've been using haven't been working, right? Like
Yep.
I would say risk is a hard one because it's hard to put this dollar value of how it impacts them day to day. When you go
Well,
say, well, that's a $4 billion lawsuit.
yeah.
It doesn't hold any weight, right? Because it doesn't really happen. So what's going to be the metric that's going to move the needle with engineering leaders? And I think time savings is one, and the efficiency is the other, and then automation's the third. Because if you can completely remove them from the evidence collection flow, which is our goal, once you have 95% accuracy with the evidence, now you can go automate it, and you may not even need the engineer to touch it at all, which then completely eliminates it off their plate. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here moving forward. I'm very excited about kind of some of the changes that are coming out in the industry and some of the work that we're doing in our own company. But again, I think it's just an untapped field. And when I talk to other professionals in the field, I don't think very many have really started thinking about changing it, because in the end, everybody knows that the bosses are going to write the checks, right, to go get the audits done. So the real question then is how are you going to change the paradigm? So I think it's a very exciting space that I know there's a lot more work to go do.
Yeah, those are great points. And I would say in the security space, right, you can do the same thing, although I don't know that people do, right, is that you could measure,
That's right.
right, the time that it took a team to go patch something, for example, in production
That's
versus
right.
just like writing and deploying their software, for example, without that critical vulnerability in the first place. And now that's obviously a very loaded, suggestion, and it's not always
Sure.
possible. But to your point, you can measure the difference between, hey, this team did this up front before they deployed, and this team had to go do it after the fact. Who took longer, or who was faster, or how much time did it actually cost us to do those things? Those are absolutely measurable, and I would argue not a lot of people or not a lot of security programs actually go through and measure, right, kind of the capitalization of people's resources or
That's right.
time against deploying those controls or those things that they're trying to get the security team to ask them to do. So
Yeah.
definitely a great point.
Yeah, and I'll just, I think it is a great area. And I would just say that, there's always the business discussion, and you need to fix it now versus later. So taking that off the table, because it is a valid discussion. The important thing is I don't think at least in the compliance space, we ever were treating these issues like bugs, right? If you put it in engineer speak, a bug found in production is 6 to 9 more times costly to go fix than finding it before production. But rarely do you hear about our issues presented that way. And I think when you talk about changing the metric of pain to the engineering team, whether it's patching in production, the other one's downtime for the customers. You got to patch it in production. A lot of security fixes, you have to take the servers down. Do you want to be the one explaining to the big cheeses how they were put on notice that if you're letting this through, that's your call. But you find it in production, you're going to take the customers down, even if you have to bounce the servers. Every senior leader tracks customer uptime, right?
Yeah.
Every one of them. So again, changing the metrics that we use can be very powerful in changing the story with engineering leaders, which is why it's such an exciting space.
Yeah, agreed.
So we have with that, I think, let me go on. It's like, where do we go from here? And we do have a couple of questions we'll get to right after this. So before we get to the questions, so Lee, like, where do you see like security going from this point forward?
Well, I think we kind of alluded to it, right? I mean, automation and, continuous compliance are, the direction that I'm trying to shift a lot of things towards. And, for the reason that you mentioned, right, is that let's take humans out of the equation where possible, because not that humans aren't great, but they are our most costly resource, right? And let's use them in the most effective way that they can do things that humans are good at, which is making, critical decisions about things with like information, right? But if you can, automate a lot of those things like continuous compliance or rollout of controls or, security guardrails, for example, that, kind of shove engineers or developers towards the right behavior without being an impediment to the business. I think that's where I think a lot of security programs at least are going, right? Which related to this conversation will have a benefit on compliance because, right, if you already have those things ingrained into the product stack or the application stack or the technology stack, right, you don't have to spend that time, to your point, on the back end saying, hey, Mr. or Mrs. Engineer, we have to go and do this other thing to be compliant with this regulatory issue. It's already built into the product and you can go from there. So, I really think, with a lot of the timely topics around AI and automation
Mm-hmm.
and, honestly, what we're seeing in general in the macro tech industry, which is like, you're seeing this kind of hangover effect after COVID, where during COVID everyone was like, "Yay, we're hiring! This is great!" And now after COVID, everyone's like, "Haha, just kidding! Like
Yeah.
budgets are interesting." And it's not, it's everyone, right? The whole tech industry is kind of like looking a little bit around, saying like, "What the heck is going on here?" And so I think, with that kind of macro environment, right, there's a necessary optimization that is occurring within all of the technology businesses to say, what can we do more efficiently with the things that we have while not throwing bodies at these problems, right? And so it's not just a compliance or a security issue. I think this is a general technology issue where it's like, let's use the AI, let's use the, machine learning and large language models and all of the great things that people want to do to make us better. And then free up those people to do really the more impactful things that they're better at than the kind of mundane route type of processing that we may have them doing right now, which is not efficient, right? Let's get rid of peopleware and move more towards people being valued. So that's kind of where I'm at least trying to shove a lot of things. I know that's where the industry is trying to go as well. And that's where I think, related to this topic of conversation, in order for both a security program and a compliance program to be successful, that's really how we're going to be really modernizing these type of efforts going forward.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, we've alluded to a lot of it. I still think for compliance, it's really more about how do we continue to drive the change in thought about what security and compliance means now and needs to be as a full-fledged equal feature to every other feature work. Because to me, it comes down a lot to the prioritization, right? Because a lot of the impacts aren't as immediate with, say, sales teams or customers, but you need to have it done. So how do we continue to drive what that value is for moving the ball forward with either compliance or security fixes or specific features that are needed for regulations? And I think that's going to be a big part of the next cycle of compliance as it continues to mature. And how do we continue to scale it at the right level and continue to push all these activities to the left with engineering, which requires in some cases a lot more, let's say, shared ownership model of expectations between both either the central governance type model, which you need for a lot of the regulations now, along with the translation to the tactical implementations and the behavior change that we need to drive with engineering leaders. So I think that that's definitely one of the great areas that we can dive into moving forward, which are different tactics about what are different ways we've seen that happen. Because again, a lot of it is really around changing what the overall perception of value is for our programs, security or compliance. So I think that's great. And so with that, Lee, I think what we'll do is we got a couple of questions I'll throw up here. So while I try to figure out this software, I think the first one is this one. Let me go to here. Okay, so here's the first question is what is your thought on unified compliance frameworks to relieve audit fatigue?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. I was kind of mulling it over, when the question got posted, and here's my candid, opinion is that, like, look, this would be the holy grail, right? If you just had one compliance framework that you had to follow and it satisfied your financial industry, your healthcare industry, your government industry, your external, whatever European markets and everything. Wow, fantastic, right? Let's definitely simplify that. What does that look like in reality? I just don't know that it's realistic, right? Because why would a business want to go through such a large and I would say probably unwieldy compliance framework that would have, hundreds and hundreds of controls for, financial stuff like handling credit cards or Swift transactions or whatever, if they don't operate in that space, right? And then how are you going to balance it where okay, well, maybe they choose this subsection, but not this subsection. It seems like it might get very, very messy. So, I mean, I applaud the idealism and the thought process, because I definitely think, the compliance space and honestly, some of the security control frameworks can be exceptionally complex, in terms of navigating them. But in terms of practicality, I don't know that would ever be a reality unless, the UN could somehow, get everyone together on the same, binding resolution across all of our countries and industries and things like that. So that's just my general thoughts. A great idea, not sure it's practical.
Yeah, I have to mirror and agree with what you said there. It's unfortunately, most engineering, unless you're in a company that has a framework that you have to adhere to, they're developing against a different interpretation of a framework, right? Especially if it's not homegrown and you have these standards set. It's very difficult and costly to transition and rewrite code to a unified framework. And I think you see it from time to time based on overall corporate decisions, which can happen. For example, a company may decide that they're going to use one security infrastructure for the whole company, and you might have had two, But again, that comes with a charter, right? We talked about that before, is a governance aspect to be able to set that kind of policy and then give people time to migrate to it and make that change. And that can be very costly. And I think that, again, I agree that, ideally we would love to have unified frameworks, but it's just very challenging and costly. And the business is likely not going to fix something that's technically not broken, right? Like even the efficiency would have to be so high to make the change, or the risk so great that it overrides the cost to go put everything else on hold to go rewrite a lot of that code or change that infrastructure. So again, great question. I just think that practically it's a very hard model to get to.
Yeah, I will say as an add-on to that is that there are efficiencies you can get, right? A lot of the compliance frameworks do overlap, right? And so, maybe if they overlap enough, then, to your point, they can rewrite them and get there. But practically, I don't see that happening.
But that's a great point, though. That goes back to the being able to build a real valuable business case that either shows that the money and time saved by doing that is worth the cost, right? The return on investment's there. But that requires, at least in the compliance area, you have to go to a whole different level of understanding the engineering business that most compliance teams, at least when I was on the other side of compliance, never really dug into because they weren't engineers. And so they really didn't understand how to make that translation of value that would then convince that engineering engineer that there was real money that they could see to go save by aligning to a unified framework or even a unified tool, right? Because who's going to make that translation? The engineering team likely isn't invested in doing it. So who actually is going to make that business case, I think, is a really good thing to think about as you want to move to this. You got to have a carrot, something that's going to resonate with them. The currency has to matter. So I think that's the biggest point on this one for me is you can make a case for it, but you have to be able to show where that value is really going to come back to the business owners.
Agreed. Totally agree.
Okay, so the other question we have is, what are your thoughts on the role of AI in the continuous compliance paradigm? Lee, go ahead. I'll let you start.
Yeah, I think AI has a lot of potential here. I was ruminating about this, a couple weekends ago, right? And, look, across the security and privacy and compliance space, right, there's new rules and new regulations and new things coming out all the time, right? And if there was a way, right, to automatically look at those changes and map those back to, for example, your environmental control framework, or flag, for example, the ones that have a significant enough delta, right, that you're going to be like, hey, this is a risk. You're going to want to prioritize and spend your time, right, in this area because those are the areas that you're weakest for an evidentiary reason or a security control reason or a risk factor or whatever. Like, yeah, absolutely. Why wouldn't you use, the latest technology like AI to try and help make some of those decisions for you and automatically process those changes, technologically, so that you don't have to throw humans at it. But, I don't know that if anyone has that, or maybe that's a startup idea, feel free. But, I don't know that that's there. But absolutely, I think if your company supports the policy and is able to, use AI for their benefits, I think it has a great potential for a compliance and security program.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot of opportunity in the AI space on governing compliance and security, right? Because a lot of the things you used to do is about threshold monitoring and looking for changes in current behaviors. Like AI is great for that kind of predictive way of doing things, right? Like you can also use it to track new features coming in, evaluate against the current state about, what are the differences and anomalies you're seeing, and then maybe run those through different types of scenarios to maybe put a risk factor or a cost factor on it. Say, hey, this is the same kind of risk as the, say, cross-site scripting risk is in production, where you have to take the servers down in order to fix the issue in production. I think there's a lot of opportunity for AI, but I do think that not everybody understands yet as what the regulations and rules are going to be for the use of the data. I know that a lot of companies are struggling with that right now. These regulations are coming out, like the White House one that recently released, and they don't even have very strong guidelines about what success looks like. So I think this is going to be an evolving space and one of the biggest ones over the next year for security and compliance to really understand what the boundaries are of usage, and then developing models where we can use it effectively without getting ourselves into compliance and security trouble. So I think it's definitely an interesting space that we're moving forward with, and it'll be interesting to see what comes out over the next year. Thanks for the questions. It's a really good one.
Yeah, agreed.
So with that, I think we're pretty close to the end of the time. And so what I'd like to say, first of all, is thank you to everyone who joined, and that this is going to be one of a number of different live streams and topics we can put on the channel. So we'd really appreciate people's help in giving us like going down to the chat later and maybe giving us suggestions for things you'd like to see. We can talk about those types of topics or other ones as well. And again, this is an area I think that a lot of us as professionals, we don't really have the same type of community as other ones do, where we're really talking about not just the different compliance frameworks, but how do we actually effectively share best practices and look at some of the bigger issues that are coming as we continue to modernize. So with that, Lee, any final comments before we kick off? And again, Lee's, the blog is down below, as well as the link to his LinkedIn profile as well.
Yeah, no, I appreciate. I'm glad that we were able to make this happen, and we've already rattled off like half a dozen follow-on topics.
That's right.
That we can ruminate on. So yeah, definitely would appreciate people's thoughts and comments. If there's a topic that you'd love to hear about or want to pick our brains on a topic, we're happy to consider it. But overall, thanks for joining, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. Really appreciate it, and have a great afternoon. Thanks everybody. We'll see you next time.
See y'all.